Amy Hasbrouck, many of you know her, and if you don't know her, you should know her, but you've certainly probably seen articles by her and her commentaries. Amy actually should be really lauded for the amount of work she's done in research, especially with the Quebec reports that she has done research on, because very few people have actually done the ingrained research into the Quebec reports that Amy has done. Amy is a disability leader. She's with Not Dead Yet in the US, as well as she founded Toujours Vivant Not Dead Yet. She's the president of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. She's just a great leader, and she's got a fair amount of information to share with us.
Thank you. So I think that my topic is going to dovetail quite nicely with Leonie and Ramona's topic, because I want to talk about the problems in politics of vulnerability. And I need to make my thing go forward. Okay. In the Carter decision, the Supreme Court said that society should protect vulnerable persons from being induced to commit suicide in a time of weakness. So that's one of the few protections that was actually in the Carter decision. So, and several people have used the word vulnerable persons today. And so I wanted to do a little deeper thinking about who are vulnerable persons, what makes people vulnerable, and what does it mean to be vulnerable. The words vulnerable and vulnerability occur 33 times in the Carter decision. And mostly that comes in the form of the phrase the vulnerable or the socially vulnerable, used as a mass noun, which is objectifying and dehumanizing, and that's used 13 times. And it also is used twice in the preamble to Bill C-14, but it does not occur in the body of the statute. And one thing I want to point out is that for this presentation, I'm bringing in a lot of material from Catherine Frazee, who is a professor emerita at Ryerson University in Disability Studies, and she also is one of the co-conveners of the Vulnerable Persons Standard Coalition. So they came up with some ideas about how vulnerable people should be protected. And there's an article that is mentioned that she wrote in March of 2016 called "The Vulnerable, Who Are They?" And it was in the Exchange newsletter of the Canadian Virtual Hospice. Okay, so vulnerability has some similarities to disability in that the definitions are evolving, and there are three kind of steps that have been undertaken. First is the traditional view, where vulnerability and disability describe a personal attribute. A more equitable view looks at the role of social factors in shaping vulnerability and disability. And where I'm proposing that we go today is that these definitions need to evolve toward a political view where vulnerability and disability are seen as political factors. So rather than thinking of vulnerability as something that's, you know, about a person or an individual, I want people to think of vulnerability as an imposed political choice that affects people. So the medical model of disability is the problem is located in the person who needs treatment or cure. And an individual personal attribute view of vulnerability, and this is from the dictionary definition, is if as it relates to a person in need of special care, support, protection because of age, disability, or risk of abuse or neglect. So those are that's sort of when you're thinking about vulnerability as an individual problem or a personal attribute. And vulnerability is something over which people don't usually have control. It places people in a group, such as elders, disabled, poor, LGBTQI, or Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And the group is seen as other by those who have power. And inclusion in the group is also not in the person's control. And to avoid negative effects, some people try to deny that they have that attribute, or they overcome, or they try passing. So try to hide their membership in the group or hide the attribute. People defined as vulnerable need support, care, and protection, yes. Again, this is the individual view. And they cannot control what happens to them or ensure their own survival. And vulnerability has a negative connotation, and it's associated with words like weak and fragile. And the opposite holds true. The expectation of Western capitalist society is that maturity equates to independence, and without one, we can't have the other. Okay, so let's move on to the social model of disability. Disability is caused by the interaction between a person's physical, sensory, cognitive, or emotional limitations and barriers in the environment. That's the definition that the United Nations use for disability. Okay, so an equitable view of vulnerability, which is provided by Catherine Frazee, is that vulnerability is a universal experience. All humans have that experience. Humans mobilize buffers against vulnerability, and a person's invulnerability is related to their ability and their level of social, it's related to their level of socioeconomic privilege. For some reason, I can't see my whole slide because of the pictures, so I'm missing some of my words here. All people are vulnerable at different times. All infants need care and to survive and thrive. Everyone relies on the social contract, public utility, supply chains, public services. Everyone gets sick and has difficulties and setbacks at different times. Again, this is taking it beyond an individual attribute. So we develop buffers to build resilience, such as getting access to resources and self-esteem, family, community, and social status. And those are subject at times, again, once we start to get into the political discussion, this is where people come under attack. So the idea that life with a disability is less worth living than life without a disability is where I think the political slant needs to come into this definition. Our level of vulnerability varies according to our privilege and the resources that we can mobilize. And one of the examples that Catherine Frazee gives is that an infant born in Oshawa in 2016 has more defenses compared to an infant born at the same time in Aleppo, Syria. Vulnerability is as much a matter of context as it is of personal condition. And again, the difference between individual coercion, which is what is talked about in the Truchon decision, the judge Baudouin talked about, oh, these people weren't subject to coercion, but there's more than one form of coercion at work here. And what I'm hoping that people can sort of learn to communicate is that the coercion is not just one individual saying your life is worthless and you should die, but that coercion is a social factor where if Jean Truchon and Nicole Gladu are afraid of being forced to live in an institution, and if Jonathan Marchand is struggling against the Quebec system, if he's trying to get a program for personal assistance services, and the bureaucrats in Quebec are fighting tooth and nail, that is a form of coercion, and that needs to be addressed on a political level and recognized as a political problem. So vulnerability in its social sense is not always bad, but it needs to be understood as a political problem. Okay. Probably most of you had already heard of the social model of disability. But in the last few years, disability rights activists have expanded their understanding of what disability justice means. So a disability justice model is the social and political systems have created an ideal body and mind built upon the exclusion and elimination of a certain group of other people from whom profits and status are extracted. So disabled people are stuck in institutions, and that creates a livelihood for all of the people who run those institutions and who work in those institutions and the bureaucrats who oversee those institutions. And in the disability justice model says that whereas in fact, all bodies are unique and essential, all bodies have strengths and needs that must be met, and we are powerful not despite the complexity of our bodies, but because of them. And this was first proposed in 2016 by a woman named Patty Byrne after a meeting of some disability advocates from a group called Sins Invalid. So extrapolating the political idea to a definition of vulnerability, we could say that a political or social justice view of vulnerability is that people are made vulnerable. And that idea has already been put out by Catherine Frazee and Rhonda Weeb by virtue of their socioeconomic, racial, gender, and political or other status. Now, here's where it gets fun. Rashad Robinson is the president of Color of Change. And he is an African-American man and has not had a lot of contact with the disability community. And he's talked about rejecting vulnerability as a personal trait in a TED talk that he did last year. And he talked about that vulnerability is not a personal trait, but that Black communities have been under attack. And at a webinar on July 26th of last year, and I unfortunately have not been able to get this because it's not been made public, he applied the same principle of vulnerability as a form of attack to disabled people. I was there, I was at the webinar, I heard it, but the transcript isn't available. I can't cite it. I've written to the organizers, they haven't responded. It's been very frustrating. But this is, to me, a really important moment when the progressive community recognizes the inclusion of disabled people as a subjugated, as a discriminated group. And that's, so the solution or the way to affront this is both by telling the truth about what's going on, not saying that it's not an individual's characteristic that's the problem, but the fact that disabled people are discriminated against and considered less valuable, that we need to tell that truth, and we need to unite and struggle for change. Okay, so a personal attribute may or may not contribute to vulnerability. People of color, Indigenous people, LGBTQ people are singled out for discrimination, but the attribute doesn't contribute to their vulnerability. There's nothing about being lesbian or Black or even Indigenous that makes somebody vulnerable. It's just that they are discriminated against that makes them vulnerable. But for women and people with disabilities and children and elders, there is an element of the personal attribute making them vulnerable as well as the discrimination. So I think it's important to remember that it's not just the discrimination, that there is something about us that creates vulnerability, and we can't deny that that's a fact, but we also need to recognize that it's discrimination. When people are made vulnerable, they're less able to mitigate the negative effects and develop buffers and resilience or mobilize resources, and they face discrimination that causes or increases vulnerability. And some examples of this created or discrimination-based vulnerability are environmental racism and health disparities, hate crimes and domestic violence, the institutional bias that prefers putting people in institutions to providing home-based services, and assisted suicide and euthanasia. Now, flourishing can and does occur in the final stages of terminal disease, as Catherine Frazee points out. But you need early palliative support, you need self-directed home care, and you need mental health and spiritual care and peer counseling. And palliative care is not available, as Leonie and Ramona pointed out. Peer counseling hasn't even been mentioned, but we've been talking about that since 2014. Peer counseling is necessary, and there needs also to be suicide prevention intervention, which I forgot to mention there. These services produce better outcomes, improved quality of life, reduced pain and other symptoms, less depression and existential distress, and longer life expectancy. We all know this. This is fundamental stuff. There can be no free choice to die, while old, ill, and disabled people don't have a free choice in where and how we live. But less well understood is the impact of sudden vulnerability on persons who have enjoyed social and material privilege and security. So Diane Coleman of Not Dead Yet in the United States has often talked about the 4 W's: the worried, white, wealthy, and well. Wesley Smith talked about this group as well. The people who are promoting euthanasia and assisted suicide are the worried, white, wealthy, and well. And they are, their agenda is the one that's leading the way. Vulnerability itself seems for them to constitute an intolerable suffering. And dependence is inconceivable, and vulnerability is unthinkable. So more on the impact of sudden vulnerability, concerns about loss of independence and dignity top the list of reasons for assisted suicide and euthanasia requests, and rank higher than actual pain or symptom control. And as Catherine says, the toilet, it turns out, is a tyrannical force in our adult lives. Because the worst thing for many people, and this was an example, one of Jack Kevorkian's victims said when she became incontinent that was it. That was the point at which she knew she wanted to die. So there are external threats to self-esteem, like having to wear diapers and drooling are highly stigmatized departures from what is expected of adult bodies. And you can see how that is reflected in the frequency and tone of these words used in media reports and online comments. And Catherine noted that there was a doctor who spoke disparagingly of diapers in a forum in a submission to a parliamentary committee. So this is very common. But there's also other external threats, which is constant exposure to devaluation, which wears down resistance, reduces resilience, and leaves people more open to positive and negative inducements to MAID. So the positive inducements would be honored for the sacrifice, courage. So that's where the organ donors fit in. And the negative inducements are to avoid loss of dignity and being a burden. Disability happens, Pandora's box opens, releasing a trove of internalized stereotypes about what it means to be disabled. And so all of a sudden, if you become disabled later in life, you become all of those things that you've seen, the villain with the hook or the pitiful, Tiny Tim character. And there are several possible responses. One of them is to drink the Kool-Aid. My life is worthless because I can't do X, Y, or Z anymore. You can deny or reject the disabled self. I'm not disabled like them. Or you can question what you've been told your entire life. I'm still me. I guess everyone else is wrong. And it really has to be everyone else is wrong, because you're going to be hearing it from your doctors, from your friends, from your family, from your online, from your colleagues. You're going to be hearing it everywhere. And if you don't have the emotional wherewithal to resist that, you're subject to that internalized oppression. And I just threw in this idea because I was curious, and I don't know if it's true, but I was just curious as to whether fear of vulnerability could be linked to childhood trauma. Because when you're a child, you're very vulnerable. And if during that time of vulnerability, you're traumatized, it would make sense that that might make you more frightened of trauma, of vulnerability rather. So MAID, what does that say? I can't read it. Oops, I don't know what I just did. Okay. MAID has had effects on society that have increased people's vulnerability. Delays in providing medical assistance in dying, or assisted suicide or euthanasia, are considered to make people more vulnerable. In 2018, an Ontario court said that without the mandatory referral policy, there would be a real risk of deprivation of equitable access to healthcare, particularly on the part of those most vulnerable members of our society. So if people don't get MAID as soon as they want it, if they don't get euthanasia right away, then that's a bad thing. Safeguards are portrayed as obstacles now. And this gets back a little bit to what Leonie and Ramona were talking about, some of the ways in which society has changed because of the assisted suicide and euthanasia in Canada. And in March of 2016, emergency room doctors in Quebec were reminded by the College of Physicians of their obligation to revive people who attempted suicide following 2 incidents in the fall of 2015, where people weren't revived. Vulnerability in the MAID program, how do we respond? Every request for MAID should be treated as requiring emergency intervention. And that's another point Catherine Frazee makes. That means mandatory suicide prevention intervention. And a service package must be in place, not just mentioned. So that would be income supports, appropriate housing and self-directed attendance services to prevent forced institutionalization, effective pain relief and symptom management, mental health care, spiritual and personal and peer counseling rather. And that's it. Thanks. Any questions?
Incontinence was listed as one of the reasons of assisted suicide in an opinion by Judge Goodwin in the majority opinion of the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court upholding the right to assisted suicide. Do you want to comment on that, Amy?
Yeah, I had mentioned that one of Jack Kevorkian's victims also said that incontinence was the triggering event for her to ask for his assistance to die. So people are very afraid of being unable to control their bodily functions. And you could think of that as a personal attribute, but what I'm proposing is that we think of that more as a political problem, that incontinence is considered such a bad thing that people would rather die to avoid it. We need to add a political understanding rather than saying it's a personal problem. We need to say that when people are made to feel that way, that's a political problem.
So, Amy, Evis gave us a question. What if the infant has a disability in Oshawa and is vulnerable to the doctor's suggestion to the parents? Obviously, that's your reference to your comment before about Oshawa, yeah.
Right, exactly. And that's absolutely true. And that's why we, in Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet, submitted comments to the Council of Canadian Academies in their study on the issue of euthanasia for people under 18 for children. And we submitted as detailed comments as possible, but the CAC process was not very open. And so even though we did submit comments and we did several webcasts on the final reports that were at the beginning of 2019, we did those webcasts, 4 webcasts, 3 on the topics and 1 on the overall group of reports. Even though we did that, they're going to bring it up again. And this is my other thing that I've been harping on. There needs to be an appropriate 5-year review of Bill C-14. And I've been working on pulling together information for that, and so is EPC.
So Leonie made a comment that in some parts of Canada, it's easier to access a wheelchair. I mean, it's easier to get made than a wheelchair.
Yes.
You might want to comment on that.
Yeah, it's not just wheelchairs. As I said, Jonathan Marchand is another person who, like Jean Truchon, is stuck in a nursing home in Quebec. He has been there for 10 years. He has a tracheotomy. He has been, when I first talked to him in 2014, he said he was in favor of assisted suicide. And then he called me in October of 2019 and said, I want to tell you that I changed my mind. And I changed my mind because I realized that this is something that's being imposed on us. And I said, yes. So he's been struggling with the Quebec bureaucracy to try to get a personal assistance program in place. And he is not the first person to do that. And they are dragging their feet. They are doing everything possible to prevent this. They're exaggerating how much it would cost. They're saying it would be too difficult. They're saying they can't change the law. They're just doing everything possible to prevent a self-directed personal assistance program from being instituted in Quebec. And it's just this idea that disabled people have a place, and that place is in institutions where we can take care of them, and because they are what? Vulnerable. And that's why we need to think of vulnerability not as a personal attribute, but as a political situation.
Ramona made a comment. There's evidence of young victims of sexual assault choosing euthanasia in the Benelux countries.
Indeed. And I mean, that is not surprising. It's not surprising that one of the people who was victimized by her therapist. And you know, talk about the fox guarding the hen house. This is not a situation that's appropriate. And again, this is a political problem. This is where a woman was victimized in part based on her personal attribute, but it's also a political issue where violence against women is accepted, and that is not, and that led to that woman's death, and that's not appropriate.
Right here, there was a question, could we ask for a moratorium on assisted suicide until we're offered proper care? Now, and then it says, well, healthcare is not considered a constitutional right, which is sort of funny considering that it's the right to healthcare. In many ways, it's pushing euthanasia and saying that there shouldn't be conscience rights because people have a right to this. Right.
There's two things to keep in mind. One is, in the Carter decision, the Supreme Court never addressed the issue as to whether disabled people were experiencing discrimination under the old system or whether they would experience discrimination under a new system. And our argument at the Council of Canadians with Disabilities and at Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet, is that if we have a system where non-disabled people who express a desire to die are given suicide prevention, whereas disabled people and ill people are given suicide completion, as Ramona and Leonie mentioned, that is discrimination on its face, and that is illegal under the Charter, and we need to change that. The other point I wanted to make is that in the Carter decision, the Supreme Court said that Parliament had to create a carefully designed system that imposes stringent limits that are scrupulously monitored and enforced. And our argument around doing the 5-year review is that once we do that 5-year review, we will be able to prove, even though we don't have a lot of university think tanks on our side and studies, and even though the monitoring system doesn't collect information about deaths, about euthanasia that happened that are not reported by doctors, we believe that we can prove that that this is not a carefully designed system. It is not, does not have stringent limits, and they are not scrupulously monitored and enforced.
So what Amy's referring to, and I think it's obvious to any Canadian, that the Bill C-14, the original euthanasia law when it passed, required that there be a 5-year review. And now first of all, that review has not happened, even though it was supposed to start in June of 2020. But secondly, now the Justice Minister is saying that review looks like they're going to limit it to the issues of where they plan to expand further the law, which seems to be ridiculous, knowing that the actual legislation required a fulsome 5-year review. There was another question from Heather saying, are there any charter challenges from the disability community concerning lack of supports for people who need access to services? Any current charter challenges, Amy?
Well, no. Partly because, well, there have been some challenges that have gone through human rights commissions. There was one in Nova Scotia that basically people who were forced to remain in institutions because they didn't get support services in the community. It was people with cognitive disabilities, and they received a positive result from the Human Rights Commission, but unfortunately it was limited just to that particular group of people. They didn't generalize the result to all people with cognitive disabilities. There is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, of which Canada is a signatory, requires that community living options be available. But the problem in Canada is that because healthcare and home care are provincial functions, the federal government has no power to force provinces to offer those services. And so the provinces, it has to be a province by province issue. And so it hasn't been successful. I want to make a point here, which is that one of the things that the disability community has had to be very careful about is not using the E word. Eugenics is absolutely what is going on here. The problem is that it is also the third rail of this debate. And if there was any need for proof of that, the experience of Harvey Schipper, it would bear that out. He was one of the people who was appointed, I believe, as chair of one of the Council of Canadian Academies committees for doing the review on expansion of euthanasia and assisted suicide. However, because he had at one point made reference to assisted suicide and euthanasia as a form of eugenics, he was drummed off the committee and lost his place. And so we've had to be so careful about not using the word eugenics, because every time we try to talk about this as eugenics, we are slammed and accused of being paranoid and all kinds of things. So that's one technique that the opposition has used, and they've unfortunately been able to use it successfully. But in fact, this is exactly what's going on. And one of the reasons it will be exciting to work with other disenfranchised populations is that they have been able to point out how the health disparities, the environmental pollution issues, environmental racism are forms of eugenics and not been slammed. So that's one of our hopes.
So Amy's talking about eugenics, and a lot of people may have forgotten what eugenics means just because it was more prevalent at the time of the Second World War. But eugenics really is the elimination of certain people based on their qualities, their race, their whatever. And obviously people with disabilities are calling it right when they say that euthanasia is certainly being used as a form of eugenics. And that's part of the attitude behind it.